God must be sexy, like Eros inspires you to enlightenment. I admit, religion can be very, very boring. Fortunately, that wasn't always the case. An example of this is even a bishop from Milan, 4th century. Religion wasn't boring then, and Ambrose was clairvoyant. He even foresaw his own death date, and he managed to die exactly on Easter. That's quite an achievement compared to today's bishops. Ambrose had a thorough knowledge of Virgil, Cicero, Philo, and Plotinus, among others. The last two have to do with Plato again. And Ambrose, as bishop, tried to teach mysticism to his parishioners. He also left some pretty great lyrics. If you want to take a closer look at Ambrose, see my book Jesus, Prayer, and New Mysticism, starting on page 235. First, I'll go back to the time before Ambrose, namely Plato. Plato's tip for mystic beginners: fall in love. According to Plato, one can begin the path to self-knowledge and truth in a completely earthly way by falling in love. After the initial frustration, when the feeling of being in love crumbles a little, you can then clearly remember what the strong attraction was initially based on. The love was not directed at this one limited person, but at an overarching aspect that also appears within her. The flame that previously roasted one only shared in this super eros power. According to Plato, we fall in love with beauty. However, for Plato, beauty can be experienced on different levels. Of course, the focus is primarily on physical beauty, nice and good. But what good is it to you if your Mr. Baywatch or your superstar who looks so beautiful is so cruel? That's why we're moving with Plato to the next higher level, from physical beauty to mental beauty. Mental beauty means harmonious actions according to Plato's virtues. Beautiful actions are even more important than physical beauty. But what use is a wonderfully pretty person who is emotionally beautiful if his head is confused? Spiritual beauty. According to Plato, clarity makes something even more beautiful than perfect physical and ethical design. This is just one example of how Plato imagines the mystical ascent into the knowledge of one's own being. So it starts with concrete relationship experiences in everyday life, full of beauty. He takes everyday frustrations into account quite normally. He then moves into ever greater emotional clarity, increasingly into mental clarity and spiritual freedom. And so, according to Plato, man comes to see the beauty inherent in everything. And only this comprehensive beauty, this spiritual clarity and spiritual self-knowledge represents, according to Plato, man's deepest longing. Now let's jump from Plato to Origenes, or Origenes, however you want to pronounce it. Origenes, I admit, I'm an absolute fan of him, learned a lot from Plato. In my opinion, he is the greatest theologian of the 2nd century, and yet it is clear that, like the Gnostics, Origenes also had to be banned because a theology that works to liberate people's consciousness benefits neither the ruler nor the prince of the church. So let's look at what's left of Origenes in the written work. Luckily, during my theological training in East Berlin, I had a patristic, a specialist in the early church, who was an absolute fan of the origins, so I won the lottery. Origenes from the love game between logos and anima sounds abstract at first, but let's make it more concrete. After all, it's about eroticism. Eroticism in the sense of mysticism. For Origenes and Ambrose, it made sense to use this erotic path of knowledge, known since Plato, for Christian mysticism. If I now say to make it fruitful, we are perhaps already being too specific. Of course, they didn't have any really erotic texts, but if you look closely, there is the so-called Song of Songs in the so-called Old Testament. The Song of Songs supposedly goes back to King Solomon. In fact, these biblical texts are a collection of Egyptian or, to put it more broadly, ancient Oriental love and erotic songs. It's crazy that the book Song of Songs came into the Bible, but it is precisely the mystics who need such texts. The lyrics sing about the desire of two lovers for each other, from tender to physical. It's about longing, finding physical fulfillment, for example, when going into the garden. Song of Songs, chapter 4, verse 12 to chapter 5, verse 1, and then again the separation again. Before Origenes, the love roles were distributed across individuals. There was Christ as the bridegroom and, in a very less erotic way, the people of Israel or the entire church as a partner. Origenes was then the first to speak of a love relationship between the individual and Christ, or the individual soul and Christ. In doing so, he became absolutely formative for the Christian love mysticism tradition. Again, if you want to read this in more detail, my book, Jesus, Prayer and New Mysticism, from page 351. There you have all the sources. And that's how it came about. So it was the Origen's fault that monks and nuns of all people wrote highly erotic texts. Let's take that. The Abbot Berner of Clairvaux, born around the year 1090 to 1153, and he also gave sermons on Eros. Let's take the quote. "Oh yeah, violent, burning, impetuous love which you didn't refer to yourself. You tolerate thoughts, spurn everything but yourself, and are content with yourself alone. You reject order, you don't care about propriety, you know no measure. You victoriously override everything that seems to be common sense, custom, advice, and consideration. There are even sweeter quotes in Bernhard's Eros sermons. But let's continue with Ambrose. Hardly anyone talks about that. But I had fun, so to speak, taking a closer look at the forgotten love mystics. I thought that was cool. Of all things, a bishop, and then not in the Eastern Church, i.e. Constantinople, but in the so-called Western Church, i.e. Milan. Let's take his writing De Isaac vel Anima, preferably in German, about Isaac and the soul. This text is about the fire of lovers. Here Ambrosius describes phases of complete confusion and, as befits a good love story, also the absolute pain of not understanding, because what is seen overshadows everything that can be understood. Also the pain of missing any experience. Also letting go of mystical experiences and returning to an everyday world in order to then open up to earthly life again. In his writing, Ambrose speaks of a 3-stage, but also a 4-stage path of initiation. I'll spare you the discussion of the scholars now. Let's take Plato first. He only knows 2 stages. If you take his texts seriously, Plato was initiated into the ancient mysteries, namely by Eloises, and he only knew a 2-stage scheme, the small and the great mysteries, and later these stages were of course further differentiated. So let's first take the 4-fold scheme in Ambrose's path of initiation. It's about firstly finding, secondly losing, thirdly, that's so beautiful, finding again, and finally the happy ending, namely union. The sexy, happy ending of the bride and groom. That's exactly how Ambrose thinks. It's all clear. It's written in the Bible in the book Song of Songs. This is how mystics read sacred texts. That's when things get a little more exciting. If you compare Ambrosios and Plato, then Ambrosios is not just an abstract scheme, but actually a love story. He has historicized this path of initiation, and here everything is related to biography, and it is human. It is open to human failure. For him, it is also about renewed alienation and new rapprochement, but so that you can finally get some erotic quotes from this writing by Isaac Ambrosius. By the way, these are all sermons that he gave in church. Quote, "At a first stage, impatiently longing for love and not enduring the absence of the Logos, the bride asked to be worthy of his kisses, and she deserved to see the beloved, and she was introduced into the king's bedchamber." Ambrose refers to chapter 1, verse 4 from the Song of Songs of Love. When the bride and groom were in conversation on a second level, she rested in his shadow. But suddenly the Logos left. This always means Christ, but that is also a very important ancient philosophical term. But suddenly the Logos left. You can also think about pure consciousness. Suddenly the Logos left them in the middle of the conversation, but didn't stay away from the seeker for long. He came again, leaping over mountains and hopping over hills. Soon afterwards, while speaking his beloved language, He jumped away like a deer or deer calf and left her. As a comment, all these pictures with deer and hills, these are again metaphors from these ancient love songs that Ambrosius simply takes up to tell his love story as a mystic. When the bride did not find the man she was looking for in the room on the third step, not at night, not in the city, or on the streets, or in the squares, she called him back again with her requests and her erotic charm so much that she too was even called closer by the bridegroom. So she makes herself so sexy that he longs for her himself. On the fourth stage after Ambrosius, he wakes her from her sleep. At the same time, even when she was sleeping, she was still awake in her heart, and so she could immediately hear the voice of the person knocking in her sleep. Only after a while did she stand up because she couldn't believe the speed of the logo, and when she opened it, the logos passed her by. She went out, she looked for him with her wounds of love, and finally she found him. She held on to him so she wouldn't lose him again later. These are simply 4 steps according to Ambrosius. This is more of the erotic aspect of seeking, finding, and then making union in sleep. At the same time, Ambrosius illustrates 3 stages of initiation, and he also illustrates this with the relationship between bride and groom. The 3 stages of initiation, again in the writing De Isac Quae Anem, from Institutio Processus Perfectio. Institutio means establishment, processus means progress, perfectio means completion. In the introduction phase, i.e. the lowest level, people are still largely blind to the spiritual worlds. Ambrose draws on Plato's comparison from the allegory of the cave and speaks of a shadowy recognition of reality. Quote, in the first stage, as it were in the introduction, the soul still sees shadows. It is not yet touched by the revelation that the Logos is approaching, and the day of the gospel has not yet dawned on it up to this point. Quote end. The spirit of the Logos cleanses the eyes and ears in what Ambrose says is the introduction of the soul. It acts like a seed of a plant, which in the development of spiritual senses, i.e. clairvoyance, will name, quote Ambrose. Those who are adorned with spiritual senses have eyes like doves, with senses that are keen to understand the mysteries, that is, to see the invisible mysteries and to penetrate the mysteries of the divine writings. My comment Ambrose assumes that there are people who simply read the biblical texts, perhaps also try to interpret them literally or historically, but understand nothing. A higher level of consciousness is therefore required to even understand the dimensions into which spiritual teachers want to lead their students. At this introductory level, Ambrose says that here we are still passing through, not already penetrating, as Mary was later completely penetrated, where the Lord Jesus was placed like a seal in her innermost being. Ambrose interprets that the Song of Songs is primarily part of a ritual path of initiation. It is also clear that all of these sermons were held for the initiation of the newly baptized and in preparation for them around Easter, because the Song of Songs texts play an important role in the initiation rites and in the subsequent mystagogical explanations. The person to be initiated has his everyday life, and has so far only perceived the environment with his everyday senses. His, as Ambrose says, is the soul's eye, and with this Ambrose again takes up Plato. The soul's eye of weeping is initially still weakly developed. His eye for finer worlds needs to be sharpened. Therefore, explanation processes must go through. Mentally and emotionally, he needs to be reorganized as a personality, so to speak, and his actions will also be directed towards new goals. Ambrose says, I quote, "This is the eye that sees that great and true beauty." My comment again, hello beauty, thinks of Plato. This is the eye that sees that great and true beauty. Only a healthy and strong eye sees the sun, and only a good soul sees good things. Therefore, whoever wants to see the Lord and what is good, become good. Only by going through these clarification and reorganization processes can a person gradually follow the logos, i.e., pure, clear consciousness, into the higher regions on the mystical path. The mystic's developmental goal is to be conformed to Christ. The transformation takes place through constantly repeating individual moments of union with Christ. In them it can happen that people forget that they are still a physical being under physical living conditions. The consciousness of Christ fills him so much that his physical sensual reality is completely outshone by it. The attention is then undivided, focused on Christ's consciousness and presence. Again, quote from Ambrose, "When the soul had heard, 'Come hither,' and remarking that she could not be with Christ in the flesh, but is with him only when she is with him in consciousness, she was in fact conforming herself to his will, to be conformed to the image of Christ. She no longer feels the dress of the flesh and has already given up physical union, as if she were a spirit being, in Latin jam quasi spiritus. So my comment is that she has given up union with her own body." Continue with the quote. "As if she had already forgotten that even if she wanted to, she could no longer remember this connection, i.e., with her own body, i.e., I took off my dress. How should I put it back on?" So my comment, help, how do I get back into my earthly body? Let's move on to the third stage, perfection to be depraved. Perfectio is simply a Latin word for the Greek teleti, consecration. So that is a real mystery term, initiation term, i.e. initiation, consecration. Ambrose means by this the perfection, i.e. the completed development of the soul. With the progressive union with the Christ consciousness, distinctions between the sensual, spatial world and inside and outside disappear for the initiate. According to Ambrose, Christ is outside, but within us, he is in the midst of us, even if we do not see him physically. This is simply an actually unknown Ambrose, super mystic, super insightful, someone who understands Plato, someone who also understood Origenes from the 4th century, when the church was not yet completely in state hands and when Christianity was really still an initiatory religion. And in addition to Origenes, Ambrosius, I also really love Evagrius Ponticus. So you don't just have to stare at Master Eckhart all the time. What effect did this early mysticism have with initiation and being conformed to Christ in this form of love mysticism? Let's just take a Benedictine abbot, the top monk monastery, Rupert von Deutz. You probably haven't heard that often either. He died around 1130. Rupert von Deutz leaves us with a detailed account of his erotic experience of Christ, i.e. a monastery abbot, yes, a monk. In a dream, which he experienced as a mystical reality, the altar becomes a bridal bed for Rupert von Deutz, i.e. a marriage bed. I'll just quote Ruby now. He says or writes, "I stood in front of the altar and saw the cross of the Lord in the middle of it. When I looked at it more closely, I recognized Jesus with his eyes open and turned towards me. This wasn't enough for me. I wanted to grab him with my hands, embrace him, kiss him. As soon as he saw this thought of mine, my desire, he wanted it too. I felt that he wanted it, and through his will, the altar opened up in the middle and accepted me as I ran in. When I was like that island's, I grabbed the one my soul loves, held him, hugged him, and kissed him for a long time. I felt how gladly he accepted this sign of love, since he himself was sitting among the kisses. Since he himself was among them, he opened his mouth so I could kiss deeper." So much for the quote. It should be clear that after these great French kisses with God, Robert decides to become a priest.